Hello, and welcome to Our American Government. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we were together, we looked at the three branches of government, particularly focusing on their main functions. Today, we're going to look at amending the Constitution to see how this document, which created our nation, changes over time. The first thing to look at is the idea that the founding fathers knew that this would be needed. They created a constitution which could be changed to adjust to the needs of the nation. They did not want the country to have to rewrite a constitution every time there was a new evolution in society. So the Constitution specifically built in an amendment process into Article 5. This shows not just how to propose an amendment, but how to get that amendment to the Constitution passed or ratified. They intentionally made this process difficult, but not impossible, so that the Constitution could change, but that it would not change too easily. The process for proposing an amendment to the Constitution allows two different pathways. One way to propose an amendment is through a vote of 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. That is, 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the members of the Senate have to agree that it is a good amendment. Then, the other option is 2/3 of the states holding a state convention to propose the amendment. Now, the state convention approach has been tried twice, but they've never succeeded in proposing an amendment. Only the first option has ever been successful. Now, when it comes to ratifying or passing an amendment, there are, again, two ways that you can do this. Ratification turns on to the states for both of them. The legislatures within the states can approve it, but it has to be 3/4, or in the United States with our 50 states, we would have to have 38 states decide that they believe the amendment to the Constitution is a good one. The other way to do it is have a state ratifying convention, where it's not the legislators, but the people themselves that come together and approve that amendment. Now, the first option is the simpler one, and it is the one that has been successful most often. However, there is a single occasion where the second option, the state ratifying conventions, was used and successful. This was for the 21st Amendment. The 21st Amendment, what it did was repealed the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment had made the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcohol illegal in the United States. The people got together, formed conventions, and threw out that amendment to the Constitution with the 21st. Now, there are other ways that the Constitution has changed over time, through indirect means. The first is that the Constitution has been changed through congressional laws. These are subtle readjustments and reinterpretations of constitutional meaning that Congress has tinkered with through the laws of Congress. The founders knew that this would be needed and that a full formal amendment process wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. An example of this is the dramatic expansion of the judicial branch of our government. The Constitution created a single court, one Supreme Court. But Congress knew that more courts would be required as the nation grew, and now we have well over 100 federal courts. This was not something that was denied to Congress through the U.S. Constitution, and therefore Congress acted on it as though it was a constitutional intent. Now, another thing that Congress does is clarify specific words and terminology within the Constitution. This is because the Constitution frequently used vague terms to describe powers. They wanted the nation to reinterpret those words to fit the needs of the time. One example of this is the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors. High crimes and misdemeanors is not defined in any way. What is a high crime? What is a misdemeanor? Well, there are things that Congress can impeach a federal official for. That is, they can start a trial and kick them out of office for conducting high crimes and misdemeanors. But what does that mean? Well, Congress gets to define those terms when they're seeking to impeach a federal employee, as they did with President Clinton in the 1990s. He was impeached, although he was never removed from office because that is a separate process. Now, the President of the United States also has the ability to change the meaning of the Constitution or adjust it to fit the needs of the time. One example of this is, again, a phrase in the Constitution that applied in 1841 when our first sitting president died. President Harrison died about 30 days after taking the oath of office. At that time, John Taylor became the president of the United States. Technically speaking, the Constitution does not make Taylor the president. The Constitution gives Taylor the powers of the president. There's a subtle but important difference there. But Taylor decided to move forward with the title of president and took the presidential oath of office. Nobody challenged him on this because although it was not specifically what the Constitution said, it was what made sense. This was later clarified, much later, through an amendment to the Constitution. Now, if a president dies, the vice president very clearly and absolutely does become the president of the United States. Another thing that presidents can do is they conduct a lot of foreign affairs through executive agreements. An executive agreement is an agreement between the United States and another country, but it does not have the force of a treaty. This is because the president is much more involved in foreign affairs now than they used to be. Treaties are long processes that require Senate approval, but an executive agreement can be reached quickly. The downside of them is that they can be canceled by the next president, whereas treaties cannot without Senate approval. Court decisions is the final one we want to talk about, and it's perhaps the most clear and permanent informal changes to the Constitution. This is through the court's power of judicial review. If you remember, judicial review is their power to declare laws to be constitutional or unconstitutional. Now, in our judiciary, there are two types of judges. We have those that issue judicial restraint or believe in judicial restraint. This is a belief that we should look just at the Constitution, its exact phrases, its exact meaning, and not deviate from that at all. On the flip side of that are judicial activists that believe that the Constitution is meant to be reinterpreted as the nation and its views evolve. Now, an example of this evolution of ideas within the nation, it can be seen when the Supreme Court sometimes disagrees with itself and will reverse its own decisions. Actions which were once constitutional are later ruled to be unconstitutional. The best and clearest example of this in U.S. history are two Supreme Court cases. In 1896, the Supreme Court, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled that segregation was legal, that you could legally separate people based upon their races. However, in 1954, the Supreme Court looked back at its own policies and said that not only was that position wrong, but that society itself had evolved to a point where we needed to make this correction. And so in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself and made segregation illegal in the United States. Thank you for visiting this lesson. Next time, we're going to be looking at the amendments themselves. We're going to be focusing on a few key amendments that have really helped the Constitution to shape what our country is and what it stands for. This has been another lesson of Our American Government. Farewell.